Curious Lloyd.
So once again, I've come across with some creepy unsolved murder cases with some reasonable theories. So let's take a look at the 5 creepiest cases I've found, and hopefully, with your help, we can take a stab at solving them like a boss. Who put Bella in the Wych Elm? Here's what we know about the case of Bella in Wych Elm. In 1943, the skeletal remains of a woman were found inside of an elm tree in Hagley Wood, Worcestershire, England. There was a piece of taffeta in the skull's mouth. They even managed to misplace the post-mortem report and the actual victim somewhere down the line. So, just about everything about this case remains guesswork. It was World War II era England, so they were busy with a lot more important stuff. But even then, it was less than customary to find lady skeletons hanging out of inside trees. So, her identity was a mystery, and the cause of death was also another mystery. Though it was probably suffocation, even the basic logistics of a random woman ending up dead in a tree in Worcestershire remained an enigma. If it was a method of hiding a casual Friday murder, it was a really odd one. Now you see, it's probably not easy to shove a limp corpse inside a tree even before rigor mortis sets in. Of course, there were theories about the victim's identity. She might have been a local prostitute, or she might also have been a Dutch woman who had too much to drink, passed out, and was fatally shoved in a tree in a weird attempt to scare her into getting sober from a local guy called Jack Mossop and his Dutch cohort. Curiously, Mossop died in an insane asylum before the body was found. He had been committed there because of reoccurring nightmares about a woman staring at him from inside a tree. But the real mystery of Bella in the Wych Elm happened after she was found, and in fact is the reason we know her as Bella at all. Now you see, someone in the area knew, if not what happened, at least who it had happened to. Soon after the body was found, mysterious graffiti with the words "Who put Bella in the Wych Elm" started appearing in the area, and variations of the phrase have continued to sporadically pop up to this very day. The Mossop theory came from the guy's cousin 10 years after the body was found, so it should probably be taken with a sack of salt. Also, the graffiti was probably started by someone who had a fair idea about the victim's identity. As for the identity of the victim, let's point the blame stick at the bad guys of just about everything in that era. There are theories that the woman was killed by a Nazi spy ring, that she learned too much about them. Others say she was a Nazi herself and ended up dead in a tree due to a terminal case of being a little too obvious Nazi spy in 1943 Britain. But the latter version interests me the most, because that way, we might even have a solid candidate for Bella. That would be Clara Bauerl, a German cabaret singer who had spent time in the area and could speak English with a convincing Birmingham dialect. According to a former lover, she was a well-connected Nazi who was recruited as a spy and set to parachute to Britain in 1941, only to disappear immediately afterwards. So maybe she bumped into some hostile locals or fatally messed up the landing. Either way, someone who saw her die or discovered her body before the authorities knew about her must have recognized her. Before the Bella graffiti reached its most famous form, at least one tag read, "Who put Clara Bella in Wych Elm?" Now in just roughly 8 pints, much like a 1940s era British cabaret visitor might have done, and say Clara Bauerl out loud. The Seal Chart Murder. In 1908, Mrs. Caroline Mary Lloyd was found dead near an isolated empty summer house in Seal Chart, Kent, England. She had been shot twice in the head, execution style. Though there were traces of a hasty jewellery robbery, that was pretty clearly staged, only because she had no visible valuables before she was shot. But also, the killer had collected the cartridges and made an effort to leave as little evidence behind as possible. This was no random killing, but a premeditated murder. But why? There was no motive to be found. Caroline and her husband, Major General Charles Lloyd, who had no enemies. But speaking of the husband, the Major General had been walking with his wife before they parted ways, and Caroline headed towards the summer house. He was also the guy who eventually found the body. As the investigation churned on, self-proclaimed experts and plain old nosy citizens started bombarding him with accusations and hate mail. He became a complete outcast in a few weeks and was forced to sell his home and seek refuge at a friend's estate. And then, less than a month later, Major General Charles Lloyd was on his way to meet his son in the train station. Instead, he chose to hide in the nearby bushes and unexpectedly threw himself in front of a train in what was deemed a fit of temporary insanity. The weird thing is that there was no way the man could have done it. Charles Lloyd continued his hike to a nearby golf club after separating from his wife, and the people he met could provide him with an agreement for the first time of the murder, which we know was 3:15 p.m. because witnesses heard gunshots from the summer house. He was also a 69-year-old man, so it's not like he could have sprinted to the summer house, murdered his wife, staged a robbery, and returned to his path while still maintaining the agreement. And he readily presented all 3 revolvers he owned to the authorities, and none matched the bullet holes found in his late wife's skull. So it's obvious that the guy didn't do it. Even if you ignore his alibi, the man died alone and unexpectedly by jumping in front of a train. There is no way that narrative laws of the universe allow that to be anything other than Mrs. Lloyd's real killer covering his tracks. But the problem is, this leaves us with little choice but to tie the murders to an unexpected enemy. But hold on to your horses, because there's a theory that the real murderer was a man called John Dickman, who was later scandalously hanged for a murder in the train despite very little proof, which some people take to mean that the law may have dealt with some retroactive punishment from a certain high-profile murder he could never be connected to John Dickman. So the Dickman theory goes, John Dickman was a poor small-timer attempting to raise the pillars of his future wealth by placing an ad in the newspaper, begging for financial aid. The ad was a huge swinging hit, as Mrs. Lloyd answered it and sent Dickman a big check. Unfortunately, it wasn't suitably sizable for Dickman's needs, so he likely forged it to a bigger sum. So being very unhappy for the fact that she had been cheated, Mrs. Lloyd had a bone to pick with Dickman. Careful not to rub her the wrong way, Dickman managed to arrange a meeting between Mrs. Lloyd and himself, under the guise of returning the money, only to shoot her before she opened her mouth to her husband, which would have obviously been a huge pain for Dickman. The Jameson Family deaths. In 2009, Bobby Dale Jameson and Sherilyn Leanne Jameson and their 6-year-old daughter Madison mysteriously disappeared in the mountains of Oklahoma whilst looking to buy a property. 8 days later, their abandoned car was found in Latimer County, containing the family's mobile phones, IDs, wallets, their severely malnourished dog, and $32,000 in cash. There was no sign of the family themselves, and the only thing the investigators could determine was that they sure hadn't gone missing voluntarily. So I'm thinking, this has to have been a drug deal. A couple drives in the middle of nowhere to meet a contact, Breaking Bad style. Things go lopsided, and people get killed, also Breaking Bad style. But if you start digging a little deeper, suddenly, each and every theory laid in front of you is a straight-up horror movie plot. Sherilyn's mother is absolutely convinced that Madison was on a hit list of a mysterious cult. I'm inclined to dismiss that line of inquiry, because her reasoning was that the hairdresser's cousin claimed that Oklahoma is full of terrifying cults. But that doesn't explain the family's pastor. But Bobby was eyebrow deep in a battle with ghosts and evil spirits that haunted their house. I'm talking about reading the Satanic Bible for combat tips and looking for special demon killing bullet stuff here. Perhaps one of the most interesting non-horror leads was the petition for a protective order which Bobby filed 6 months before the family's disappearance. It stated that Bobby's father, Bob Dean, had threatened his family's lives on 2 occasions and had even hit Bobby with his vehicle. However, it's worth noting that the petition was promptly dismissed, and Bobby Dean's brother is absolutely certain that he wasn't involved in the disappearance. So could some of Bob Dean's supposed gang contacts have offed the Jamesons? Did he meet the Jamesons in the desert for whatever reason, and things escalated to a confrontation wherein Bob Dean hunted down his family in the desert? Well, a year after the Jamesons went fatally mad, the McStay family disappeared in a suspiciously similar way in Victorville, California. Their empty car was located near the Mexican border, and in 2013, the same year the Jamesons were found, a motorist stumbled upon their remains, buried in shallow graves in the desert. But this case has a suspect. The police arrested the McStay father's business associate for the murders in 2014, and he's awaiting trial to this day. For whatever reason, the guy turns out to be innocent and had accomplices. Whoever really offed the McStays met the Jamesons in Oklahoma. Maybe he had dealings with them. Maybe he merely bumped into them as they were driving wildly into the mountain roads. Whatever the case, the end result was that the McStay killer chose to do a practice run for his upcoming identical crime. Mary Pinchot Meyer. Mary Pinchot Meyer had her spoons in a lot of soups. She was a famed Cold War era socialite, painter and general celebrity, which was roughly 40% of the world's female population at the time. She was romantically associated with JFK. She was even the recipient of extremely thirsty love letters from the president, which may or may not have something to do with the way her former lovers continued to praise her charms to this day. Unfortunately, as you can probably guess by her presence in this video, her talents didn't include staying alive. In 1964, Pinchot Meyer was shot to death point blank in Chesapeake, Ohio Canal towpath in Georgetown, supposedly by a black man in a light jacket and dark cap. The only guy in the area who matched the description was Ray Crump, who initially seemed like a promising suspect. They found him 40 minutes after the shooting, and he was a quarter of a mile away from the scene. He was also soaking wet after a dip in the canal, and he gave contradicting stories about his presence in the area. However, it soon became apparent that he could not be connected to the crime. There was no gun, no blood on his clothes, no forensic evidence whatsoever. He was acquitted, and since no other suspect emerged, the case remains a mystery to this day. Which brings me to the subject of the CIA. Curiously, the agency's paw prints were all over the case. And for that matter, Pinchot Meyer's entire life. It turns out, she had something of a love-hate relationship with the agency. On one hand, Pinchot Meyer was considered something of Marilyn of the intelligence circles, and even married an agency big shot. On the other hand, she had a counterculture streak a mile wide, and it was not unheard of for her to drop acid with Timothy Leary. Combine that strange duality with the way certain powers obviously affected the investigation behind the scenes. For instance, the judge in the Crump's trial ordered that the victim's private life couldn't be discussed at all, effectively limiting Pinchot Meyer's existence to the site of her murder. And you can probably guess where the favourite theories for the killer are pointing. There are two main theories about this case. One is precisely what you would expect. The CIA had Pinchot Meyer killed for whatever reason, up to and including that she might have found out that the intelligence agency assassinated a certain former lover of hers in Dallas. Another one is much more mundane. She was really killed by Ray Crump, who lucked out thanks to the lack of forensic evidence and sympathetic jury. So this is a tough one. Crump was clearly acquitted, and besides, he really seems like a patsy, or the essence of being in the wrong place or wrong time to me. But then again, the CIA kind of rings wrong as well. For the same reason, I've always found it hard to believe they have a hand in the JFK assassination. The victim was such a high-profile person that an assassination gig like this would require an absurd amount of professionalism and silence from a massive number of people, and it's scientifically impossible for such a sizable group to exist without at least one of them turning out to be an idiot who will eventually blurt out something they shouldn't. Besides, if they were really that good, surely they would have done a better job of framing the culprit. Maybe have some bike messenger deliver a gun to the murder site, then claim he did it and immediately kill him in a shootout or something. The abduction of Dorothy Jane Scott. What would you do if a stranger suddenly started stalking you? I'm not talking about the occasional threatening Facebook message or a Twitter death threat from someone after you disagree with a Trump tweet. Those can get pretty uncomfortable, but they are nowhere near as bad as a completely unknown person watching your every move, leaving you creepy little messages and itching ever so closer like the monster from It Follows. And then, one day, he reaches you. This is what Anaheim, CA native Dorothy Jane Scott experienced in 1980. Scott's personal hell started when, out of the blue, she started receiving regular threatening phone calls to her work from a mysterious man. It soon became apparent that this was no ordinary stalker. The man knew intimate details of her life and was unnervingly well aware of Scott's comings and goings. He told her he loved her. He told her he'd kill her. He told her he'd cut her up. As weeks and months progressed, he took to leaving serial killer gifts to her, such as dead roses on her car's windshield. Unsurprisingly, this freaked Scott out. She took up karate and considered buying a gun. On the 27th of May that year, the worst case scenario happened. Scott's co-worker had been bitten by a black widow spider, so she drove him and another colleague to the emergency room at the UC Irvine Medical Center around 9 p.m. 2 hours later, the co-worker was discharged, but was still feeling a little weak. Scott told the two that she'd go and get her car at the door, in case the co-worker couldn't handle the trip back to the car park. A while later, the co-workers waited at the door and saw her Toyota station wagon approach, then blinded them with the headlights and sped away. At that point, it became clear that Scott wasn't driving the car, or at the very least, had someone nasty in there with her. The car was later found burning in an alley. There was no trace of Scott or her abductor, and that's when the really weird stuff started. Out of the blue, the stalker started calling Dorothy's family. The first call came a week after abduction. Scott's mother answered, and a male voice asked if she was Dorothy's mother. When she said yes, the voice said, "I've got her," and hung her up. The calls kept coming on almost every Wednesday, carefully timed so the mother usually answered, but they were never long enough so the police could trace them. The caller sometimes said he had killed Dorothy, and other times indicated she was still alive. This didn't stop until 1984, when some of Scott's bones and belongings were finally found scattered near Santa Ana Road. Her watch had stopped an hour before she was abducted. The bones were charred, which may or may not have been because of a bushfire in that area a couple of years before, and the coroner was only able to estimate that the bones had been there for around 2 years, instead of the 4 she'd been missing for. A week or so after the discovery made the news, the phone rang 2 more times. On both occasions, a man's voice asked, in a knowing tone, "Is Dorothy home?" After that, nothing. So, exactly what happened here? Did the stalker kill Scott immediately after abducting her, like the watch indicated? Or did he keep her for a couple of years somewhere? And why the years of calls to the mother, whom the killer was also clearly keeping tabs on? Was the watch a deliberate ruse by the killer? Well, the most popular theory seems to be that of the killer was an unrecognized man who called the front desk of a local newspaper after they ran the story about the case. The guy knew certain specifics about the case and claimed that he'd finally been moved to attack because he felt Dorothy was seeing someone. However, I believe there's more to the case. Now you see, the stalker wasn't just a random guy. Before her disappearance, Dorothy told her mother that she could recognize the voice harassing her, but she couldn't put a face and name to it. But think about how many people like that you have in your life. No one ever really listens to the people's voices. For example, co-workers, petrol station attendants, store personnel, neighbours, people you see every day and interact with regularly, yet you never really pay attention to. Dorothy Jane Scott must have had plenty of such people in her life too. And because of the world is sometimes a terrifying place, I think one of them paid very close attention to her. So she was probably stalked from afar and ultimately killed by someone she interacted with regularly, but didn't pay much attention to. And that could happen to anyone, like any random cashier, salesman, or an online acquaintance could be secretly plotting your demise right this second. Well, who knows?